Ladies and gentlemen, the American Jury and Bulldog Nation, I am honored to have a special guest with me today, Peter Bronson. Peter, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Eric.
Now, Peter, you and I got acquainted when I was doing my WLW radio days.
That's right.
I had you in to be an expert commentator. I forgot why I brought you in. What was the issue that I would bring you in on?
I don't know.
Was it anything and everything?
Probably everything, like city council, and who knows, maybe it was the riots in 2001. I don't know.
I forgot what it was.
There was all kinds of stuff.
Well, we're having you on because I want to help you promote your book, which your company published. By the way, I love the name, Chili Dog.
Thank you.
Very appropriate for Cincinnati. Forbidden Fruit, Sin City's Underworld, and the Supper Club Inferno. Now, I have admitted to you, I always crack up that these people do these interviews and books about this thick, and they just got it. I've read the book. I have not read this book yet, but I'm going to read this book over the holidays because it intrigues me. But what is the book about? Let's begin with that. What is the book about?
Well, I've always believed that the Supper Club fire in 1977 is probably the biggest story in our regional history. It is, for all intents and purposes, unsolved. The experts who investigated never did come up with a determined cause of the fire. We of course have heard the popular version is that Stan Chesley brought his class action suit and determined that it was aluminum wiring. That is really not true. I mean, he did get a settlement, but the first case he lost, the experts that testified said it couldn't be aluminum wiring. That was not, that they couldn't show that. There's overwhelming evidence as I began to look at it, and I was skeptical, but there's overwhelming evidence, I believe, that this was not an accident. And you cannot find a survivor, I didn't find a survivor of that fire who believes it was an accident. So
that's pretty powerful.
It is very powerful. There's just way too much evidence. Several eyewitnesses saw people wiping down the walls with some kind of a milky white substance who didn't belong there. We had several also witnesses who interrupted two men who were working in the ceiling of the zebra room where the fire originated and who did not belong there and claimed that they were fixing the air conditioning, and that room had no AC.
Okay, your contention then, relative to this book, and the story, is that the Supper Club fire was intentionally set.
Yes.
Do you draw any conclusions of who and why?
There are many motives and theories floating out there. The one that I settled on is, I think, the most plausible, and in many ways I just lay out the facts for people so they can draw their own conclusion. Do I have a conclusion? Yes, and I think it comes through, but I think it's a balanced presentation. So what I think is probably the most plausible is that in 1977, I didn't even remember this, but there was a huge push nationally for legalized gambling going on. And the Beverly Hills Supper Club in Southgate had an ideal location right next to the new highway that's coming through. And Dick Schilling, who owned the Supper Club, was already planning an expansion for that purpose. He had heavy equipment on the site to continue expanding his Supper Club. However, there were previous owners of that club who wanted it back, I believe. And one of those people was Mo Dalitz, who was the godfather of Northern Kentucky during the mob years. He was one of the principals, the founder of the Cleveland Four mob, which included Mo Dalitz, Lou Rothkopf, Mo Kleinman, and Sam Tucker. Sam Tucker actually moved to Northern Kentucky to manage the Beverly Hills Supper Club. The mob owned it for decades, from 1936 to about 1960. And they basically, that was their crown jewel.
Why'd they sell it?
Well, what happened, that's a really good story. So they got the club. Here's a better story. They got the club in 1936 by burning out Pete Schmidt. He had the most spectacular supper club in Northern Kentucky, which was the showplace of the nation. He had all these great acts coming through. Well, Mo Dalitz, who had been given this territory at a mob summit of Ohio, Michigan, and Kentucky, he came down and visited the club and decided he had to have it. And he made a couple offers to Pete, and Pete, who was a tough guy, he was part of the George Remus gang. If you remember George Remus,
right.
biggest bootlegger.
I've read the two biographies about Remus that have been recently published.
Legendary bootlegger.
Yeah, great story.
Oh, he's really the father of the mob and crime in northern Kentucky, because his bootlegging actually occurred on this side of the river.
Right.
That's where he made the liquor and distributed it. And when he went to prison, his guys that were in his gang went with him, but then when they came out, they set up all the casinos and nightclubs and bootleg liquor places and gambling and prostitution in northern Kentucky. And Pete Schmidt was one of those guys.
So you think that the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire was probably set with some bad intention from mob-connected folks?
Well, you only have to look at the context. Again, they burned it out in 1936 so Modalitz could take it over.
Context is always important.
It is. Now you go forward. Let's flash forward. Over all these mob years of all these control, they owned everything. They had the Lookout House, they had the Tropicana, they had every important club except Pete Schmidt's Platorium, which was the one he built after the Beverly Hills. And they basically took over all of northern Kentucky and ran everything. So they owned all the politicians, all the police. They went as far as the governor's office and beyond in their control and their corruption. So then you look at 1970s. Every year in 1970, there was a spectacular nightclub fire of undetermined origin, and nearly all were suspected of being arson. In some, they found accelerant. And in the Beverly Hills fire, which followed right, each year you had one of these fires. Well, in the Beverly Hills fire, the first thing that happens was the investigators and the governor shows up and said it's not arson. Why would you look at a record of what had happened in northern Kentucky over those years and immediately tell everybody it's not?
You know, one of the things that I think is really important is just because it was possibly intentionally set by the mob, there didn't have to be the intent to kill over 100 people.
Exactly.
And the nightmare that happened was how the place was locked up. Once the smoke and the people getting away, and everybody in northern Kentucky. In '77, I was 14 years old. I remember watching it on the news at night. On Saturday night, I was sitting there watching it, or Friday night, whatever night it was. But everybody has a story, and I've heard plenty of these stories. People that survived barely.
Yes.
The smoke inhalation. Just it was awful.
It was horrible.
So the fact that it was a possible mob doing. Those that set the fire, it doesn't mean that they meant to kill over 100 people. If that happened, they were probably saying, "Oh my God, what the hell? We didn't want this. We just wanted to burn the place down. We didn't want to kill over 100 people." I bet you there was bedlam.
Well, the theory, two things. The theory is among the people who have looked at this closest, and I talked to a lot of them, and they're survivors. One of them is a busboy who was working there that night, David Brock.
Yeah, he's the most famous survivor.
Yes, well, among others, there's some others.
But he's the one that he's been in the news a lot.
Exactly, because David has done along with the others.
Isn't he the one that said he saw these people? Who are the ones that saw?
Oh, he saw the people in the ceiling.
He saw the people like, who are these people? What are they doing here?
He saw the people in the ceiling and talked to them.
Okay.
So his theory is that the mob intended to burn the place, but intended for the fire to go off at 5 a.m., not 5 p.m., and they set their timer wrong.
Wow.
So somewhere in there between 5 and 8 p.m. when the fire actually blew up. It was probably smoldering for quite a while, but when it went off, it was somewhere between 5 and 8. Now, if they had set that fire to go off at 8 a.m. or 6 a.m., there would have been nobody in there.
If the mob wanted to do it for the purposes that you allege, they're not interested in killing anybody. They just want the place burnt down.
They had according to another witness, they showed up at the supper club and had a meeting with the Shillings, two guys.
And by the way, the Shillings, they interacted. I got a buddy that says they were mobsters wannabes.
Well, they had some connections to some
go ahead about that
some very shady people. Let's put it that way. So they had a meeting in the bar at the supper club when the place was empty in the early morning, and two people saw it. One of them's a waitress. I interviewed her for the book, Shirley Baker. She was there. She walked in and saw these guys, and they offered a check to the Shillings and said, "We want to buy it." And they said no. And they said, "Well, if you don't sell it, you might not have it." And they said, "Get the hell out of here and get the blank, out of here." And And shortly after that, we have the fire.
Wow.
So we have witnesses who've seen these things and who were overlooked or basically ignored by the investigators and the special prosecutors and people who were appointed to look at this.
In light of the world that we live in, I don't think it's a hard stretch to convince people that an investigation is done correctly. I mean, come on, what we have seen in 2020 in the political realm, and somebody who's in the legal realm, if people don't think that there are some behind the scenes stuff that goes down that's pretty bad that nobody ever investigates, you got to be naive.
Well, here's where
I'm one of these people that I'm not a general conspiracy theorist,
right,
but I'm somebody that is willing to accept some facts.
Skeptical,
great.
Based on your own experience.
Skeptical and say, well, I don't know about this. So the hypothesis that you're putting together and that you're going to assert in this book, I understand it. I get it. Mm-hmm. Sounds plausible to me.
Well, for sure. I started out with an open mind, and I really started out to write about the Supper Club, and that took me all the way back to the first fire. And when I had looked at all the context of the mob ownership and basically a crime empire on the southern bank of the Ohio, that was, as I put it put the sin in Cincinnati.
Right.
And you look at that and you put that in context, and then I thought, well, to really cover up the Supper Club fire, I mean, so many people would have to be corrupt or compromised. And then when I started looking at the people that were appointed by the governor to investigate, all but one, and we're talking about a half dozen people, were severely corrupt. And nobody was more corrupt than the governor.
Julian Carroll.
Yes, he was one of the most corrupt governors in Kentucky history, and that's saying a lot.
How long did it take you to write the book?
About a year.
How many people did you talk to?
Probably 3 or 4 dozen.
And you had documents and you had all that?
Oh, the documents were the jackpot, Eric. I did an FOI request to the FBI with keywords, and I plugged in people like Modell, Supper Club, Beverly Hills, Northern Kentucky, Underworld, organized crime, all these things. And I got 3 discs packed with data, and on those discs were a lot of, suddenly the Kennedys pop up. Because on these discs were all these illegal wiretaps that Bobby Kennedy did as AG when he started investigating the mob.
Wow.
And they had actual conversations in the Desert Inn, Modell and his crew, talking about killing the Kennedys.
I think one of the things that we need to point out, especially for younger people that don't remember, is that Newport was the Vegas before Vegas.
It was Vegas
It was
before
the
Vegas
mob
was cool.
before the mob.
Yes.
And this is some irony. I have a very close relationship with Glenn Fagan.
Yeah.
And his mother was an Andrews.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Screw Andrews.
Now Screw Andrews was his uncle.
Really?
And the stories that Glenn has shared with me, but you can't
His stories must be fantastic.
You can't make all old buried suitcases full of cash.
Oh, I believe it.
Screw Andrews ended up he was in the hospital at St. Luke.
Yes.
And he found dead. Somebody threw him out the window.
As our headline writers like to say, defenestrated.
Yes. But this is an irony because Glenn is now the owner of Deters Law, and he and I are cohorts in business. My grandfather, Bud Deters, who was the editor of the Kentucky Times Star, was on that committee of 500 to clean up Newport.
Really? How about that?
And here, Glenn's uncle and his family were part of the freaking mob.
We're part of the mob.
Is that hilarious?
It is. It's what irony. Well, these families are still around, and when I did a book signing recently, person after person came up to me and told me these fantastic stories. It's like, there's no way you could reach all the people that were brushed by history with the fire and with the mob in all those years. They were telling me stories about how their mother had to move them out of downtown Newport because there were so many prostitutes and gamblers and just low-life hoods and thugs on the streets. It was like no place to raise a child.
Do you cover the Sheriff Ratterman story?
Oh, absolutely.
The Sheriff Ratterman story is just epic. So
it's epic, and it's better than you thought.
I can't believe that, I always talk about that because I'm a big movie goer and TV watcher. And I watch what they turn out. And I think to myself, I am personally aware of so many unbelievable true stories that ought to be a freaking movie or a Netflix series.
Yeah.
What are they wasting their money and time on that?
Doing remakes.
George Remus.
George Remus.
Ratterman. This story that you're telling right now.
I'm telling you, Ratterman.
We're producing a story about the Dr. Droney litigation that is going to blow the world away.
I can't wait to see it.
I mean, it's just, but this is just another example of such a great story, and good for you, Peter, for writing it, and intriguing. It's got all, people love mob stories.
Well, and local history.
Local history.
I'll tell you one thing about the Ratterman story that you probably didn't know. That George Ratterman, when his story broke news, it was national. It even went international. And one of the people
Did not know that.
And one of the people who saw it was Bobby Kennedy.
Wow.
He was the brand new attorney general who'd just been appointed by his brother, and there was a lot of controversy around that you appoint your brother. And Jack even said, well, he needed job experience, ha ha ha.
Right.
So Bobby Kennedy looks at this and he goes, aha, my chance to go after the mob. And that's where he picked his first battle with the mob. He sent his assistant, Deputy Attorney General, Ron Goldfarb, and sent him to Northern Kentucky with a blank check to prosecute the mob.
Wow.
And that's when the Kennedy War with the mob began.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
You know, I have a theory, before we close here, I have a theory about why Americans love mobsters, Godfather movies, stories about it all, is that inside each and every one of us, we have our moments. Everybody where they wish they were kind of like that, because most people have some enemies, and
So
I
you can
think
say,
there's
just whacking.
But think about, how do you explain Americans' love of mob stories? I think each and every one of us, in a way, would like to be Tony Soprano every once in a while. I'm willing to admit it. There are moments where I said, man, people are lucky I'm not Tony Soprano. But I'm sure, I think each American has that innate, thing like, because why else do you explain? Why are we so intrigued with the mob?
Well, there's a certain glamour associated with it. In the Godfather movies, for example, look at the way they live. They live with limousines in compounds. They have the finest clothes.
But they could whack their enemies.
Exactly. And then you introduce the element of murder and violence. It's everything. It's sex, murder, violence.
Right.
A glamorous lifestyle.
Right.
It's like some kind of underworld American royalty.
Right. The Remus story, including like how they described the party that he threw, and the pool,
handing
and
out cars
else,
like
and
peanuts,
the castle
and
everything else.
It was something.
And they just own it.
Yeah.
Peter, thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Eric.
It's called Forbidden Fruit, Sin City's Underworld, and the Supper Club Inferno by Peter Bronson. Again, Forbidden Fruit, Sin City's Underworld, and the Supper Club Inferno. Where can they get it? I'm assuming Amazon?
Amazon, it's available, but if you want the color, full color inside like your copy, with signed copies, go to my website, chilidogpress.com, and order there.
chilidogpress.com. We'll put it on the screen.
Very good.
Peter, thanks for coming in here.
Thank you.
Great
Glad
story.
to be
I look
here.
forward to reading it. I will give you a full report after the holidays.
Please do. I'd love to hear it.
This is the Bulldog. Every dog has their day.